Hello and welcome to everybody who is joining us today for this AP4D webinar on Green Energy Statecraft. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler and I'm joining you from Sydney, sadly for me, Sydney Airport, with a difficult sort of day. But on the good side, I get to have a wonderful time and speak to some people who I'm fascinated to hear more from. So we're delighted that more than 120 people have registered to join us today. I know some of you will be watching live. I encourage you to put your questions into the question and answer. And of course, some of you will be watching after the event, which we quite understand. And we're absolutely delighted to have people from across the different communities and from Australia and internationally who've joined us for today's discussion. So what we're going to do in today's webinar is I'll just tell you a tiny bit quickly about AP4D and what we do. Then you're going to hear from the lead author, Professor Elizabeth Thurbon. And then we're going to have a sort of question and answer with the other report authors who have all joined us. Thank you for joining us today. And we do want as much as possible for you to use question and answer. One of the great things about the less distance we have these days in doing webinar is you can be part of the conversation as well. So when you're hearing things discussed, please do put it in the Q&A. Don't wait till the last 5 minutes because I won't be able to get to you, and do be part of the conversation. Okay. And if it's useful for anyone, the webinar is being live captioned. So if you're in a noisy environment or if that's useful for you, please do follow the link that's been posted in the chat, which will show you where to go. Okay, so let us kick off properly. AP4D, I think a number of you do know us, which is wonderful. I see some good old friends who've been involved in our process on the call today. But for those of you who haven't heard of us yet, we've only been going for about 3 years, and we're a tripartite initiative. We're funded from the Department of Defence and from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and we're housed at the Australian Council for International Development as the peak body for the non-profit development sector. So our job is to bring together wisdom from many different areas to improve the quality of Australia's statecraft. So that can be development, diplomacy, defence, but lots of things that don't start with D, like trade and science, economics, law enforcement, law, etc. So what we've been doing has been consulting with these wonderful experts and bringing up papers under the AP4D name. This is a new thing for us, where it's a new series called Studies in Statecraft. And the idea is that we can help platform people who have great ideas for improving Australia's statecraft, and we can help them publish that, which we have. We've got a wonderful copy on the website if you'd like to see. And we can also help them share their ideas through a webinar like this. And for this first paper in this new series, we're delighted to be partnering with the Harvard Kennedy School, their Reimagining the Economy project, which has helped sort of sponsor this and make this possible. So the authors are going to tell you about the paper in more detail. I'm not going to try and do that. But I think what I can say is that this topic, green energy statecraft, is a perfect idea of the sort of problems, the sort of issues that AP4D was set up to look at. Green energy statecraft isn't just a trade problem or a development problem or a science or a defence. It's all of it put together. And you're going to hear, I think, about the sort of the economic, the social, the political, the environmental, and the security problems that come around this. And that sort of silo-breaking approach is exactly what AP4D is proud to support and proud to have platformed through publishing this paper. So that is quite enough from me, particularly if it's noisy in the background, which I don't know if it is, I'm sorry. So I'm going to go to Professor Elizabeth Thurbon from UNSW, Sydney. She's the director of the Green Energy Statecraft project and deputy head of school and director of research in the School of Social Sciences. So over to you, Liz.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Melissa. And I'm assuming that everyone can hear me. Excellent. Wonderful. Thanks again, Melissa, and to the whole team for hosting today. And thank you to AP4D and the Harvard Kennedy School for coming together to co-publish this paper. We were so excited about this collaboration. And I think that today's launch is really timely because it comes just days after many of the government's Future Made in Australia bills were introduced to Parliament. And there's been a lot of celebration about Future Made in Australia within the government and among business and Labor and broader civil society groups. And that celebration is really justified for many reasons. But I want to start today with less celebration and more provocation. So I want to start by asking a question that is rarely explicitly asked in Australia or anywhere for that matter, but it's a question that we argue really holds the key to advancing a successful energy transition and to maximising its potential benefits to the nation, which are enormous. And so the question is, what is the purpose of the energy transition? What are we trying to achieve by turbocharging Australia's green energy shift? And for many Australians, the answer to that question will seem obvious. Well, the purpose of the energy shift is to avert catastrophic climate change. And of course, that answer is correct. But importantly, it's not the whole answer. And indeed, if you look around the globe, the partial nature of this answer becomes really obvious because the country that's currently leading the globe in the green energy transition, the country that's gone furthest with its green energy industry building efforts, the countries that has built the world's largest renewable energy system and is now really dominating the world in the new green energy industries of the future, and that's China, has never cited climate change as the primary motivation for its green energy shift, either domestically or internationally. And for that matter, neither has South Korea, a developed democracy that, like China, now successfully vies for leadership in many of the green industries and technologies that are so essential to the green transition. So this brings me to the contribution that we seek to make in our paper. Most fundamentally, our paper offers a much more expansive and we hope potentially more productive answer to the question, what's the purpose of the energy transition? And it does this by drawing on insights from other countries' approaches to the green energy shift, not just China, but developed democracies in East Asia and across the globe, from South Korea to Denmark and Canada and the USA. So what is the purpose of the energy transition? For a growing number of policymakers, the answer to this question extends far beyond addressing climate change. The purpose of the energy transition is to advance a comprehensive national security enhancing agenda. Because when you turbocharge the green energy shift, when you pull out all the stops to build the new green energy industries of the future, to phase out fossil fuels, you can help your country's pressing energy and economic and environmental and social and geostrategic challenges all in one hit. So more specifically, when you turbocharge the energy transition, you can reduce fossil fuel dependence, which boosts energy security. You can create the new high-wage, high-skilled jobs and export industries of the future, which boosts economic security. You can rapidly reduce carbon emissions, which boosts environmental security. You can promote a just and inclusive transition that's going to enhance human flourishing and strengthen social cohesion, mitigating political polarization. That's social security and political security. And for some really well-positioned countries, especially those with very substantial competitive advantages in critical resources, and that would be Australia, the energy shift can also underpin this projection of a green superpower image abroad, attract allies and investment, and boost military security. So that's the comprehensive security enhancing agenda that's there for the taking. The question is, what kind of governance approach is capable of delivering on this comprehensive national security enhancing agenda? And in our paper, that's the question that we seek to provide an answer to in the form of an ideal type analytical model. And we call this governance approach Green Energy Statecraft. And we really hope that this ideal type model will help policymakers and researchers both conceive of, that is like help them imagine, but also assess progress towards a much more ambitious and strategic approach to green energy transition governance. So very briefly, because I know my wonderful co-authors are going to elaborate, what does this model look like? Well, you can find the diagram in our online version of our paper that is in the chat, and I'd invite you to navigate towards that now. But you can see very briefly that the Green Energy Statecraft has 5 key features. So the first and the most fundamental aspect is this distinctive policy mindset. It's a way of thinking about the purpose of the green energy transition and about the state's role in strategically advancing it. So policymakers who practice green energy statecraft really view this transition as it's an historic and an unmissable opportunity to advance this comprehensive security enhancing agenda. And at the same time, they believe that because of this security enhancing potential, the government really can and it should adopt an ambitious and strategic approach to governing the green transition to advance those energy and economic and environmental and social and military security goals simultaneously. So the second feature really at the heart of the model, for very intentionally, are the socio-political aspects of green energy statecraft. This is essential to building this social and political consensus around those goals and around the role of the state in it. And that's a big challenge for Australia. The third feature relates to domestically oriented green energy statecraft, which is really these green industry building efforts to build and scale the new green industries of the future to boost export competitiveness globally and to deliver good jobs at home. And the fourth feature relates to externally oriented green energy statecraft. And this is ensuring that our international trade and our investment and our aid and our military and our energy and climate agreements all support green energy industry building efforts at home and enhance our international status and our prestige and lock in our strategic partners. And fifth, and finally, we have the financial foundations of green energy statecraft, without which none of this happens. So this is the absolute foundation, and ensuring that the financial sector really serves green industry building as well as social justice and environmental accountability efforts. So in conclusion, we're not suggesting that this model exists anywhere, right? Perfectly. Absolutely not. We're offering it as a conceptual and analytical framework for researchers and decision makers to help them conceive of and then better develop these ambitious and strategic green energy policy efforts. So over to my good colleagues, that if there's a central message from today, it's that if we really want to establish Australia as a renewable energy superpower, and if we want to use the energy shift to advance this comprehensive security enhancing agenda, then we need a governance approach that is actually up to the task. And that approach, we would argue, is green energy statecraft.
Well, look, thank you, Liz. At AP4D, we're all about ideas that are positive, future-facing and propositional. And I think this is absolutely hitting all of those buttons. You're reframing climate threats into an opportunity, and you're talking about how we can have a comprehensive national security enhancing agenda. So this is wonderful. Now, what we're going to hear is in a bit more detail what this looks like. How do we do this? And those 5 key features that Liz took us through. So to speak more, we have Liz's colleague, Dr. Alexander Hynd, also from UNSW Sydney. We have Professor Hynd from Nottingham University Business School. We have Professor Susan Park from the University of Sydney, and it looks lovely behind you, Susan, I like that. And Professor Andrew Walter from the University of Melbourne. So thank you all for joining. And I see we've already got one question in. Thank you to James Bowen from the Perth US Asia Centre. Anyone else who has any thoughts as we're talking, please do put that in and don't miss out. Okay, so Liz said there were 5 features, and the first one, and probably the most important, because if you don't have that, do you do any of the others, is this governance mindset. So I suppose one of the things I'm interested in is how Australia's approach to green energy statecraft compares to other countries. So in the paper, you talk about China, you talk about South Korea. So I'm interested how it compares with them, and also has it changed over time? So who'd like to come in on that one out of our author panel? Professor, thank you.
Happy to respond. Being currently based in China, that probably provide me a little bit advantage of addressing this question. I probably start by saying that, especially since I relocated to China, my personal observations very much support Lee's claim just now that climate change does not seem to be the primary drive of energy transition in China. Sure, the government speak about international commitment, pressures from international community on climate. But from what I personally observe, this talk largely is for international audience rather than a domestic audience in China. If anything, this probably is just used as additional justification to promote what they're going to, undertake anyway in energy transition.
So what are the domestic drivers then? Tell us more.
Yes. Coming back to your question, the distinctive features of energy shifts in China and in Korea is that what I observe is that they adopt and promote this narrative of economical and security benefits of energy transition or much earlier on than in Australia. And they use this narrative to build consensus both politically and economically. And now they are in a position, for example, China, Korea, and other Eastern Asian countries, they are in a position to use their success in, for example, exporting those renewable energy technologies, EVs, solar panels in international market to further reinforce this message. I think they have been able to do so. Obviously, one advantage is their what we call developmental state tradition. So they have this tradition of government playing a very active role in their pursuit of technology autonomy and export competitiveness. But now this tradition has evolved and adapted to and expanded to the renewable energy technologies. And this makes perfect sense because previously they played this catch-up game, but now they are able to use this notion, what we now refer to as a developmental environmentalist, in a book that Liz and I and other two colleagues just recently authored into this new industry creation. So the focus still is on technological autonomy and export competitiveness, but then there's an element of sustainable development goals, and this applies perfectly into this overall narrative of energy transition. I probably stop here, but if the audience have any questions, especially in the context of China, I'm very happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see some more questions are coming through. Thank you, Walter Conley. Who else would like to come in? Andrew?
Well, Melissa, I was going to say a bit about the social and political foundations of the transition, which are fairly critical. So building on what Liz and Hao Tan have just said, if we ask the question, what are the political and social obstacles to Australia making the kind of transition that Liz laid out, we would have to say, I think, to be honest, that they are pretty large and extensive. That this is a big governance mountain to climb. So it's an ambitious objective or set of objectives, and we really need to pay a lot of attention to these political foundations, not least because Australia is a very, very different political system, obviously to China, but even to a developed Asian democracy like South Korea. So we need to make policy shifts that are sustainable and appropriate to Australia. And we need to learn lessons outside of East Asia as well, wherever we can. I think, although, having said that, so the challenge is very, very significant for Australia's political system, and many people will have doubts that it may even be possible. But we should take note of achievements that have already been made, and these are considerable. So I'm in the glass half full camp, I guess, on this. So in Australia, we've got a pretty extensive current discussion of the different options for economic decarbonisation. We've had some pretty significant institutional and legislative change that Liz mentioned briefly, but I'll just mention the Net Zero Economy Agency within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which is a precursor to the envisaged Net Zero Economy Authority. We have the Future Made in Australia, which Liz mentioned, as well as the National Reconstruction Fund Corporation, both of which provide critical public funds to catalyse private investment in the decarbonisation effort. We have the Net Zero Commission in New South Wales. In addition to those things, we have the First Nations Clean Energy Strategy, which is part of a wider collaboration envisaged in the National Energy Transition Partnership. So all is not gloom and doom in Australia, and significant achievements have been made. And what we seek to do is to build on these. But we need also to be very cognizant of what's lacking at the moment. So we're lacking pretty clearly, I think, a political and a policy consensus, a cross-partisan policy consensus on the modalities of economic transformation, and the policy instability that Australia has gained a reputation for in this area is not helping the kind of investment that needs to be incentivised. At the same time, although we need a policy consensus, we don't want the wrong kind of consensus. That is, a consensus that would exclude critical voices, marginalised voices, that would deny the continuing uncertainties that we all face in thinking about how to achieve decarbonisation in Australia. So we need a healthy and productive debate about all of this, about goals and modalities, while at the same time minimising the risks of policy gridlock and continued policy instability from one election to another. And these are really serious challenges for Australia and for many other democracies. And meeting it is going to require building on and identifying shared goals and language. And for example, although the coalition's proposals on nuclear policy have gained a lot of airtime and indeed quite a lot of criticism, and we would share some of those criticisms. Again, looking on the brighter side, what do those proposals include? They include at least a professed concern about the need for a cleaner, a cheaper, a sustainable transition to zero emissions energy, to the revitalisation of regional economies and communities in Australia, to a stronger role for the state in the energy transition, and a commitment to the well-being of future generations. And we should welcome this and build on it. And so, obviously we need criticism, but we also need to identify shared goals where they exist. Now, identifying shared goals is a crucial first step, but, modalities is the next one. And here I think we're all agreed that we need to encourage citizen participation to underpin an emerging policy and political consensus. And the local consultations that are conducted in the have been conducted in the First Nations Clean Energy Roundtables could point the way, for example, to wider public involvement in these discussions. We think that strengthening citizen participation in the economic transition ahead is going to be critical to its success, and helpfully could also help to reinvigorate democracy at a time when democracy everywhere is in serious challenge.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And thank you. The questions keep coming in. Thank you to Cynthia Yuan and to Admiral Shree. We very much appreciate. So I suppose the next question, we've talked about governance, we've talked about social political. The next of the key features you talk about is domestically oriented. So, you know, what's the difference between the uninformed? What's the difference between industry policy and what you're talking about as domestically oriented green energy statecraft? And could we get some examples, you know, what exactly that looks like in terms of domestically oriented green energy statecraft? Who's going to come in on that?
Actually, that's me again, Melissa.
Thanks.
Okay. So yes, look, absolutely. This is a great question on the difference between domestically oriented statecraft and industry policy. And, you know, in the context of this industry policy agenda having this real renaissance in Australia and globally at the moment, I mean, in recent years, these calls for industry policy and green industry policy have been really embraced in Australia by politicians, sympathetic bureaucrats like industry groups, unions, think tanks, by international commentators like Mariana Mazzucato, all, you know, really united in this call. We need industry policy. But I mean, if I can be blunt, I think industry policy is the wrong language. And I think it's actually really unhelpful language for two reasons. First, in Australia, perhaps more than any other country in the world, industry policy is incredibly politicised and a very, very politically divisive term. Since the 80s, it's been one of the most misused and abused terms, I think, in our nation's political discourse. You know, you say industry policy and half the room just goes, oh no, ideological objection, not interested, you know, prosecuting a case from the 80s. So you just can't have this sensible debate about what strategic techno-industrial governance looks like. So that for that reason, it's just not going to be a language that can bridge the political divide in Australia or unify policy and political leaders behind a shared goal. But that aside, there's a second and I think even more compelling reason why we should not use this term industry policy when advocating for a more strategic role for the state in Australia in the green energy shift is because it actually doesn't accurately describe the governance approach that is being embraced by our most important energy and economic partners and rivals, not just China, but South Korea, the US and beyond. And nor does it capture the governance response needed in Australia. So, you know, we outline this in the paper, and I've also argued at length with other collaborators. The governments of East Asia are not just engaged in industry policy, they're engaged in quite a sophisticated new kind of statecraft, which involves a much more expansive, much more integrated approach to techno-industrial governance. So, you know, when it comes to domestically oriented aspects of green energy statecraft, these are really focused squarely on building new green industries in order to fend off or outflank or move in step with foreign rivals, and at the same time to advance this comprehensive national security enhancing agenda. And when you have those security motivations at play, like when it is actual real security concerns that are motivating the policy, governments that practice this kind of statecraft create very bold visions for new industries. They set very clear production and export, and most importantly, technological upgrading targets. They also mobilise all available financial incentives and policy instruments to ensure that those targets are met. And they're not afraid of disciplining firms or recipients who receive government support, for example, of making that support dependent on the attainment of performance targets. So in these ways, this isn't captured by industry policy, which is actually a very generic term. And it's actually used to describe any policy intended to shape the economy by targeting particular firms or industries. regardless of motivation. So it can take place in policies that have nothing to do with responding to national security challenges or building globally competitive industries. It can be motivated by pork barreling or job creation or regional development. So given these really different motivations at play, industry policies tend to be less ambitious, less targeted, less conditional on outcomes, and pay far less attention to international competitiveness concerns. So let me give you a specific example of what green energy statecraft might look like in the Australian context. So we know that this government has set its sights on establishing Australia in new industries like green iron, right? Or green metals more broadly. And it's released a number of policies aimed at stimulating green investment in those industries like production tax credits. But while production tax credits can be helpful, they're alone very unlikely to enhance a broader security agenda unless they're paired with other much more ambitious and outward-looking policy approaches. So a statecraft-like approach to green industry development might combine carefully designed production tax credits with, for example, the creation of a government-owned clean commodities trading company. And a clean commodities trading company might issue off-take contracts to guarantee long-term demand, because that's arguably like the biggest obstacle to investment in Australia that no policies are addressing at the moment. And at the same time, if this government-owned commodities trading company was established in partnership, say, with some of our most important trading partners like Korea and Japan, that might actually share the costs and benefits of green energy creation with our strategic partners. And it might not just encourage production, but also the development of export-ready supply chains and really deep trade ties. So without that demand assurance, production tax credits just risk enabling production without unlocking those broader strategic and security benefits. So that I guess that's a concrete example.
That's great. Well, and that links very well to that sense of looking at the externally oriented side, in terms of, Australia turning to trade and international organisations. So in the paper, you write that green energy statecraft must avoid the pitfalls of extreme protectionism and extreme openness. So that you've said there's a sweet spot. Who'd like to tell me more about this sweet spot?
Yeah, thanks.
You, Alexander?
Happy to jump in on that, and I guess I'll reverse the order of that question, if I may, and kind of start by talking about the dangers of extreme openness for green energy statecraft. So I think it's really important to outline how states that are seeking to lead strategically in their promotion of green industries, domestic industries, they need to have the policy space to be able to initiate these kind of initiatives without being overly constrained by international competition. And I think a really useful point of comparison here is how developing countries in particular have long complained about the extreme openness of the international trade regime, particularly WTO rules, and how they constrain the developmental friendliness of the international regime, right? So in a similar way, we can see that states that are seeking to promote these domestic green industries, that's something that needs to be tackled head on, right? On the other hand, we have this danger, this pitfall of extreme protectionism, and it's important to explain that green energy statecraft is fundamentally, really outward looking and requires not only this kind of domestic industry building, but access and the ability to secure market access to sell their green goods around the world. And I think an example of this kind of early misstep in this is the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, and how actually that was received incredibly negatively in Seoul in South Korea in 2022 because it was perceived as damaging the openness to the US market of South Korea's electric vehicle producers, Hyundai and Kia, right? So this is something that really, there have been early missteps, but there's also obviously the potential for innovation here. But, like Andrew, I'm very much a kind of glass half full person. And, what we can really point to optimistically is that this kind of dominant or previously dominant, long dominant international trade regime, the neoliberal model is currently undergoing massive changes around the world, right? And Australia in particular, as a kind of middle power or secondary state, whatever we want to call ourselves, you know, we have this strategic opportunity to make sure that the rules of this new kind of trade and investment regime globally and global governance rules that are being established around things like how do we label green goods and so on, that these rules are in the interests of development and green friendly products, and they're also in the interest not just of the biggest powers around the world, but also that Australia has a key voice here. And I think what Liz mentioned just a moment ago, and I know she's been doing some work recently on this idea of an Australia, Korea, Japan clean commodities trading company, is a really good idea, example of the kind of initiative that we could see, you know, a country like Australia playing as they try and engage with shaping what their role is going to be in the green transition. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, my last question's on the fifth of those key features, which is the money side. You know, financial foundations are always important. So my question's around, you know, the role of resourcing and how important that is in this transition. And I suppose I'm interested because we've just finished the COP in Azerbaijan. You know, has the recent COP, which has been dubbed the Climate Finance COP, has that taken us in the right direction? I think I'm over to you, Susan. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure to be here. I think you're absolutely right, Melissa. It was the finance COP, and it really almost collapsed on the basis that it was very difficult to get agreement. And obviously, when you're talking about a universal agreement, it's quite a challenge to try and get enough states that are willing to sign on to anything remotely to do with finance. And so 2009, we went for 100 billion by 2020. Studies since showed that it was incredibly difficult for states to actually meet or get anywhere near that target. And so this was particularly the alliance of small island states and less developed countries who were ready to walk out on the basis that developed countries just weren't ambitious enough in terms of what they were willing to provide for climate mitigation and adaptation, let alone loss and damage and the just work transition. So one of the issues for us is how you can transition energy use and systems when you need significant amounts of investment in the case of developing countries, the most vulnerable to climate change, grants and loans. And so how you get to, at the end of the day, they ended up with sort of 300 US billion per annum by 2035, which scholars and commentators have identified as just not ambitious enough. And so what we're looking at is trying to figure out ways in which we can have a system that is geared towards climate solutions rather than continuing to hammer out these same arguments again and again and again. And so ambition really is focused on two key things. One is ramping up the amount of loans and grants available to developing countries, primarily through the multilateral development banks, and there are significant challenges there. These are not organisations that are geared towards these global public goods. This is something they've struggled with over the last decade. But then the second thing is how to, and it speaks to some of the questions that have been put in the chat, is how you actually establish a framework for states to be able to continue to finance this transition, which can be incredibly volatile. And I think one of the benefits of thinking about a sort of green energy statecraft is that it is geared towards thinking about the long term. And this takes us beyond the immediate. And one of the things that can hopefully override the swings, the booms and busts that come with immature markets is really that we are already seeing a significant uptick in the types of competitive prices and market demand for renewable energy. And so this is where we are seeing the benefit of the fact that people are concerned enough about climate that solar is in 2025 going to overtake coal as the primary fuel use globally. So that's when you start to get lock-in and benefit values. So one of the questions for Australia is how we can mitigate the booms and busts of the renewable energy transition through investment. And that's really got to come down to the institutions that Andrew was talking about.
Wow, gosh. Well, I love that we're getting so many questions and from wonderful people here. So I might go first the question from Cynthia Yuan, who's from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, their International Economy and Green Economy Division. So Cynthia, thank you so much for joining. Cynthia's question is, I suppose, thinking about the timing that China having embarked on its green industry policies a lot earlier in other countries. What does that mean for new entrants, for like Australia, in what she's calling the global subsidy race? How are we positioned to compete with China? I'd like to take that one.
Probably I make an attempt. Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
question, Cynthia. My take on the question is, and based on my observation, is that sure, subsidy is important, but I doubt it's the most important or is the only factor that drive or help build this transition. My observation is that, as my colleagues already said, this transition is a fundamental techno-economical shift, and it requires a systematic approach. And subsidy is just one of them. When you see what happened now is that in many areas, the clean technology already achieved what we call parity with traditional fossil fuel-based energy technologies. So, for example, EV, what I see in China is that they are fully competitive when it compares with traditional fossil fuel vehicles. So, so I think that's the whole point of this paper. We need start from a mindset and then build a consensus, the social and political foundation, and then finance, and then domestic, international. And even only if we can take this systematic approach, then that shift can be achieved. So I don't think subsidy alone is the answer. And if I can also touch based on another question on the short-term and long-term approach. Again, I think this is a challenge, not just for Australia, but for all countries, even for China and Korea. I don't think there's an easy answer. And Australia needs to, as Andrew already pointed out, needs to come up with its own solution. But what I observe, for example, in the context of China, is that to responding to this long-term demand and pressures, two forces seems to emerge and playing an increasingly active role. One is the state-owned enterprises. Of course, state-owned prices, they can lead to various challenges, for example, productivity. But if you identify those sectors, energy sectors as strategic sectors, then their role in those areas, I think, can be well justified. Another force is regional governments, and some argue that the core of the success story of China's economy is the regional competition. And what we're seeing here is the regional competition also playing an increasingly important role in this energy shift again. I stop here.
Thank you. And thank you for moving on to that question about, short-term, long-term. I think that was talking a bit about robust supply, robust demand. How do we get patient capital? So thank you for that question to Walter Carnegie, who many of you would know from his amazing work on the Australia in the World podcast. If I can, I'd like to move on, I suppose, on that sense of how you build the consensus. And Jerry Corbisianos from Federation Universities asked us a question about this, if we're not talking about the saving the planet imperative, if we're moving into a different sort of paradigm, what does that do? Does that mean we're pushing into economic growth, which actually undermines ecological sustainability? Are we, going too much to the altar of global strategic power dynamics? So who'd like to come in on that?
I guess I could say something. I don't have a full answer to that question, and I don't think any of us would wish entirely to set aside the fundamental challenge of addressing climate change. So it's more about emphases. I think, look, Australia, whatever it does, cannot assure that the climate challenge will be resolved by its own efforts to decarbonise. We are a relatively small global emitter. Now, that's not intended as an excuse, but even if we had a stronger reputation for leadership in this space, it would still be difficult for Australia to solve the greenhouse gas challenge, the decarbonisation challenge on its own. I think in many ways we're more likely to be able to contribute in the form of what I would call a kind of demonstration effect. That is, for a developed democracy with a very large resource base, it's a serious challenge. And other questions in the chat too raise questions about fundamental vested interests in the Australian economy, specifically in the resources sector, and the way that they are linked in to the current business as usual model of economic growth and so on. These are all fundamental questions and difficult ones to resolve. But if Australia can make a go of a successful decarbonisation of a resource-intensive economy that is a developed democracy, a very different polity to China's, then that could potentially have a very powerful demonstration effect to a number of other countries, not least in the developing world. So I think that would be a positive. Now, just saying that it would be a positive doesn't mean that it's going to happen or that it will be easy. But I guess at the moment, we should be honest and say that we don't necessarily have an answer to the overweening interest problem that has been a defining characteristic of Australian politics over at least the past couple of decades in this policy area specifically, but that it's fundamentally linked to the question of how do we reinvigorate Australian democracy, prevent democracy from being captured by powerful vested interests that are retarding the transition. Again, we're just embarking on this project. We don't yet have all the answers to that, but solving that problem is absolutely essential. So those people calling, or asking questions about this are right, that it needs to be front and center of our work and the work of many others.
Agreed, absolutely. Well, and thank you to the attendee who posed that question about entrenched interests, which I think you've covered very well. I note also that Dermot O'Gorman from WWF has asked a bit about this. And he's been someone who I think has done more than anyone to get that idea of Australia as a green energy superpower into the public debate. Now, his question says, well, we had these same issues in a way in the 1970s. Oil crisis, how do you cope with that disruptive effect of green statecraft? Does anyone want to respond to that? Looks like Liz.
Yeah. Oh, unless Susan, you were wanting to. No? Yeah. I guess just a couple of points. I think that just to pick up on this question of, is climate leaving the agenda? I just want to emphasize, as Andrew has, that absolutely no, it has to be a goal. But in Australia, we have tended to have the debate about the new renewable energy transition almost entirely centred around the moral imperative, and that's been very open to political exploitation and division. So, for all sorts of reasons, it's good to have a broader framing. I wonder how productive it is to think about, to worry about growth versus degrowth, because in reality, if we're going to address the climate crisis, we have to dramatically grow the renewable part of the economy. We have to dramatically scale up replacements for fossil fuels if we're not to create an attendant political and social crisis created by simply phasing out fossil fuels without creating something different. So I think it's very helpful to talk less about growth in the aggregate, more about where we need to see more growth and where we need to rein in. And on the incumbents, the very interesting thing about this transition, of course, is that many of the fossil fuel incumbents who enjoy such profitability in this world are straddling both domains. They have a foot in the fossil fuel world, but they also have a foot in the green energy world. And so the question is, how do we shift the incentive structures to play more in the green energy space, and also to entice new entrants? And there are a couple of things there. I mean, first of all, making green investments much more attractive, so the government supporting through either demand creation or subsidies or various incentives helps drive down those costs, and it changes the cost incentives for investments in fossil fuels. And at the same time, we need to think about pricing carbon. So, we have the Europe CBAM. We need an Asia carbon border adjustment mechanism, and I think Australia could play a really valuable role in that debate as well. So just to say, climate, absolutely, a key and unwavering concern, but there are many ways to address it.
Well, we talked a bit about entrenched interests in the sense of companies and industries, but there's also the sense some countries can be entrenched as well. And I think we've got a couple of questions on that. So from James Rowan, who's an internationally focused researcher on climate and energy, he gets us to think about Japan and the way that Japan wants Australia to remain a fossil superpower. And from Chris Cathiravel from Monash University, he talks a bit about regions where energy resources are a challenge or source of conflict, and what does that mean for Australia in wanting to maintain geopolitical stability. So who'd like to come in on those ones? See who unmutes themselves first.
I think they're both really fantastic questions, and I really appreciate all of the questions that we're getting. I tend to think that we are in a really interesting space where Australia is used to being perceived as a fossil fuel exporter, and therefore relatively unambitious in its climate goals, and therefore in its role in international markets. I'm kind of intrigued to see the market dynamics play out between, as Liz was talking about, the carbon border adjustment mechanism through the European Union. So how many of the markets are linked to the EU? We're going to see a lot of changes, I think, under the incoming president in the United States, but it doesn't mean that there won't also still be tariff wars and challenges around Chinese products. So I think Australia does need to think very, very hard about what sort of position it wants to play in the renewable energy space. A lot of the research that's been done on the types of renewable energies, wind, solar turbines, batteries, really do look at the overall green product. And we know for a fact that the European Union and specific countries like the Netherlands are looking for green premium products. And if we can actually consider how to focus on sort of much more advanced, much more ambitious products, then I think we will be well situated. Where we go in terms of still flogging coal or gas, I think that's a real question as to how much longer we envisage that working as a national strategy.
Well,
sorry, if I could just jump in
please come in, Alexander,
as well. And particularly thinking about James Bowen's excellent question, which I think is something that we still need more research on. All I would say, and I admit this doesn't fully answer the question, is that rethinking about Australia's relationship with Northeast Asian energy partners, particularly Japan and South Korea. I think actually having that established fossil fuel relationship, in some ways that helps, right? As like a starting point for having an established energy relationship. And I think there's so many opportunities, not only to kind of redefine those relationships, which, let's face it, are not going to be around forever, but also think about how Australia can best kind of collaborate with Japan, South Korea, not just in those bilateral relationships, but also, you know, all around the region.
Well, we are almost at time, but I want to check if any of our authors wanted to respond to the last couple of questions we've got around data centres and their environmental impact and bodies like the Quad. Is there any possibility there? And a question around broadening our incentives for foreign investment by also, but at the same time being worried about too much foreign ownership. So I'll see if anyone wants to come in on either of those. Looks like Andrew's going to say a few words. Thank you.
Sorry, I guess I can say a little bit about the foreign investment regulations, which have become far more security oriented in recent years. And that happens to be another project, government funded, that I've been working on with some colleagues at the University of Melbourne and Monash. So this is a very, very difficult area, and the definition of security, or the securitization of foreign investment that has proceeded in this area in countries like Australia, but in the United States and elsewhere in recent years, has been very focused on the strategic threat, or the perceived strategic threat posed in particular by China and by Chinese-linked investors in critical infrastructure, in critical minerals, and so on. That move has in part been necessary and inevitable, but it needs to be reconfigured. So I think in a green energy statecraft framework, we need to think not just about keeping our friends over the Pacific and the United States happy about which investors we're letting into particular sectors, about worrying about whether particular investments might lead to strategic vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. These are important, and governments will need to continue to worry about these. But in areas of the kind that Liz and others talked about, in green steel and iron, and in other sectors that will be absolutely critical to the green transition, I think here we need to think again. Government has not been entirely deaf to these kinds of concerns, but if Australia has, as other people have asked, how are we going to mobilise the finance? You know, if not through the kind of market-oriented capital that Australia has traditionally relied on, or I guess particularly stock market investment, we need to think about bringing in other partners, and that will include China, and particularly in areas where China clearly has a lead in some of the key sectors that are going to be critical to the transition. Shutting them out will not help. And so we need to think strategically. Yes, we need to worry about security, but there are wider security and strategic concerns at stake here than some of those which have been identified in a somewhat narrow way, one might say, over in recent years.
Well, and thank you for pushing the ideas here and pushing the envelope and some of the thinking that we have. So I want to go back to Liz just for a few last thoughts before we close.
Oh, thank you so much, Melissa. That's great. I guess really the take-home message from us today is that there are multiple benefits to embracing both the language and the mindset and the practice of green energy statecraft in Australia. First, it's a language that's likely to appeal across the political spectrum, including the conservative side of politics, insofar as it does foreground these pressing security imperatives that underpin the transition. It more accurately describes what's going on in the world and the kind of response that's required from us if we want to meet these global competitive challenges. I think the language of Statecraft has this potential to lift the gaze and to focus the mind and to really raise the ambitions of Australian policymakers who are engaged in techno-industrial governance. It really draws attention to the strategic national significance of the activities that they're engaged in. And of course, it draws our attention to the fact that green industry building initiatives aren't just the exclusive domain of the industry minister. They're the responsibility of the whole of government and have to be led and coordinated at the highest levels. Statecraft draws our attention to the fact that the success of these domestic building efforts to a large extent hinge on our externally oriented statecraft efforts, our ability to engage much more deeply and to forge really productive partnerships with our economic and energy security partners and allies like Japan and Korea and China, and on our ability to understand the security needs of our partners and how our green industry building initiatives might help them meet their security needs as well. And it really also depends on our ability to leverage our partners' dependence on us to ensure that future foreign investments in Australia actually do have real national benefit, that we're not just sending our wealth overseas. So for all of those reasons, Green Energy Statecraft.
And that fits so well with some of the things AP4D has been doing on all tools of statecraft, whole of nation. I think, again, we are delighted to be able to host this work. And I would suggest anyone who enjoyed this discussion here today, please do share this widely. People can watch this online. You can send them a link to the paper. You can put it on social media, whatever your platforms are. So if I can just thank all of the speakers, thank them for working with us on this paper, and particularly to the Harvard Kennedy School as Reimagining the Economy program. I think they'll be watching it when they wake up in the morning. So when you do watch it, enjoy. And I'd like to thank everyone who came today. It's been a fantastic discussion and such an expert group who's had excellent questions. What I'll do is I'll also let you know to stay in touch with AP4D on social media, on our mailing list, etc. We have a lot of wonderful events like this. This is going to be hard to top, but next week we've got an event about Australia and world affairs over the last 5 years. We've got Beck Strading from La Trobe Asia and Danielle Hunt from Deakin University speaking. And so please do join us for that if you enjoyed today's discussion. And with that, and thanks to all the AP4D team who make all of this happen, thank you all again for joining us today.